November 1943. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The mess hall doors swung open, and the smell hit them first. Roasted meat, buttery potatoes, and something most of these men hadn't tasted in years. Real coffee. The prisoners stopped dead in their tracks. These were hardened veterans, men who had survived the frozen slaughter of the Eastern Front and the burning sands of North Africa. They were the master race, trained from boyhood to believe that endurance was the supreme virtue. But as they stood in the doorway of an American mess hall, they didn't move. It wasn't because they feared the guards. It was because they recognized an enemy no Nazi propagandist had ever warned them about. Abundance. It had all begun with pride. In the barracks of the Wehrmacht and the swaying holds of U-boats, the same jokes circulated like contraband. The Americans, they said, were soft. They were Coca-Cola soldiers who couldn't fight a real war without their chocolate and their chewing gum. Germany had built its army on black bread and iron discipline. What could men raised on luxury ever do against that? Joseph Goebbels, the architect of Nazi propaganda, had spent years perfecting this image. To make his soldiers brave, he made them despise the enemy. Newsreels showed Smiling G is handing out candy, painting them as pampered fools. By 1943, most German soldiers believed that American wealth was the first symptom of weakness. Unteroffizier Hans Becker, a 23-year-old veteran of Rommel's Afrika Korps, was one of those who laughed the loudest. Around desert campfires, he and his unit invented competitions to see who could tell the most insulting joke about American rations. But in the spring of 1943, the laughter stopped. If this story already has you gripped, hit that like button and subscribe. It's the best way to make sure you never miss these hidden chapters of history. And do us a favor, drop a comment, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. The desert had broken the Afrika Korps. Supply lines were strangled. Ammunition was rationed down 2 shells per gun. By the time Becker surrendered outside Tunis, he hadn't eaten a full meal in 11 days. It was 23 years old, and he weighed less than he had at 16. He was part of a mass surrender of over 275,000 Axis soldiers, and as they were processed, they were told something they didn't believe. They were going to America. On the transport ships crossing the Atlantic, fear took hold. The prisoners whispered that they would be worked to death or starved as punishment. They used their old jokes as a mask, declaring that the American camps would be chaotic and the food inedible. But then the ships entered the harbors of New York and Norfolk. The jokes died in their throats. They saw cranes like iron giants and warehouses that stretched into the haze. There was no chaos, just a machine so enormous it seemed to run without effort. It was the first crack in the Nazi myth. They had been promised a country on the edge of collapse. They were looking at a giant that hadn't even begun to strain. The train ride inland only deepened the silence. Through the windows, the American countryside unrolled like a revelation. Not the shell-cratered fields of Europe, but miles of fertile green land. Towns with painted houses, gas stations with actual fuel, civilians driving automobiles as if there weren't a global war happening at all. Becker later wrote that he pressed his face against the glass and simply stared. America didn't look like a country at war. It looked prosperous. By the time the trains reached the camps in Mississippi and Texas, the propaganda felt like a hollow embarrassment. And then came that first meal. The mess halls weren't luxurious, but they were efficient. And what came out of those kitchens was a psychological blow. Soft white bread, not the dense sawdust-filled loaves of German rationing, hot beef, fresh vegetables, and those large metal urns of steaming, dark, extraordinary coffee. The room fell silent. Some men ate with a speed that embarrassed them. Others couldn't finish at all. They sat staring at the leftover food with an expression the American guards described as grief, because, in that moment, they weren't thinking about the soft enemy. They were thinking of their families back home, standing in ration lines for turnip soup. They realized that they, the prisoners, were eating better than the German heroes at the front. In that mess hall in rural Mississippi, the war was over, not because of a bullet, but because they finally understood the truth. You cannot defeat a nation that can feed its enemies better than you can feed your own people. The routine did not change. That was the revelation that mattered most. Not the first meal. A single generous gesture could be explained away as performance, as theater, as psychological manipulation. But the meals kept coming. Breakfast arrived every morning with bread and butter, sometimes eggs, sometimes oatmeal, sometimes bacon, when the supply chains allowed. Lunch brought stews thick with vegetables and beans, and chunks of real meat. Dinner in the evenings might be roast beef or pork chops with potatoes and gravy. On Sundays, some camps served dessert pies and puddings and canned fruit that tasted. Two men who had nearly forgotten sweetness existed, like something from another world. And every morning, without fail, the coffee urns were filled. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be fed at the same level as the soldiers of the detaining power. The United States took this seriously, perhaps more seriously than any other nation in that conflict. American soldiers in 1943 were fed approximately 4,200 calories per day. The prisoners received a comparable allotment. In practice, this meant that German posts in American camps were consuming more food of higher quality and greater variety than German civilians on the home front. American medical officers who processed incoming prisoners noted the condition of their bodies with the careful detachment of their profession. Many of the men arrived, malnourished, hollow-cheeked, their uniforms loose on frames that had lost muscle mass over months of campaigning. Within weeks, they gained weight. Within months, the same officers recorded that the prisoners were in better physical condition than they had been during active service. The irony was documented in military reports with a dry precision that itself felt like a kind of understatement. In the barracks at night, the arguments began. They were quiet arguments, conducted in low voices so that the guards couldn't hear, though many of the American guards, bored by the uneventful routines of camp duty, had learned enough German to follow along anyway. The hardline Nazis insisted that this was all manipulation, that the Americans were fattening them up to break their will, to make them soft, to corrupt their discipline with comfort. They pointed to the coffee and the white bread as evidence of decadence, proof that a nation this indulgent could not sustain itself through a real war. Others said nothing and stared at the ceiling, and a growing number, quietly, privately, allowed themselves to think what they had been trained never to think. America was winning, not despite its abundance, but because of it. The letters from home made the contrast impossible to ignore. Mail was permitted under the Geneva Convention, and German prisoners both sent and received letters through the Red Cross postal system, through 1943 and into 1944. Those letters home described the same Germany, a country being systematically hollowed out by the demands of a war its leadership had never honestly prepared for. Ration allocations for German civilians had been cut repeatedly since 1942. By 1943, the weekly meat ration for a German adult was 300 grams, barely half a pound. Fat, sugar, and flour were all rationed. Coffee had effectively disappeared. In some regions, children were surviving primarily on bread, root vegetables, and ersatz, substitutes for things that could no longer be imported or produced. The letters that came back to the camps were careful. The censors on both sides were reading everything, but the meaning was legible between the lines. The people back home were hungry, and the men in these camps were not. Becker kept his letters in the breast pocket of his uniform. He read them so many times the paper began to split along the fold lines. One letter from his mother described standing for 3 hours in a queue for a small portion of margarine, and being told when she reached the counter that supplies had run out, she ended the letter, as she always did, by asking if he was all right. He had no words that felt right for the answer. He was more than all right. He was eating roast beef on Sundays. He began to understand that the truth of this war, the real truth, not the one broadcast over Reich radio, had been written in food all along, in what a nation could produce, in what it chose to share and wheat wall. By the summer of 1944, as the Allied forces drove through France and the Red Army pressed in from the east, the prisoner population in American camps had swelled to more than 425,000. They came from North Africa, Italy, France, captured in the vast, grinding advance that the propaganda machine back home was still trying to describe as temporary reversals and strategic repositioning. These new arrivals went through the same experience. The harbors, the trains, the countryside, the first meal, and the same silence fell over them. The same slow, painful dismantling of everything they had been told. Some never fully let go. To admit that the propaganda had been a lie was to admit that the sacrifices had been built on lies too. That was too much for certain men to carry, and they held their ideology close, like a wound they refused to let heal. But others, the majority, as the war dragged on, and the truth became harder to deny, arrived at a different place. Not love for America. Not betrayal of Germany. Something quieter and stranger. A recognition they had mocked this country for its abundance, and its abundance had been real. They had called it weakness, and it had won the war. When the war ended in May 1945, repatriation began slowly. Most German POWs were not returned home until 1946. Some even later. They went back to a Germany that barely existed anymore. Cities reduced to rubble. Infrastructure shattered. A population on the edge of starvation in the brutal winter that followed the Reich's collapse. Some of the returning prisoners spoke about their time in America in hushed, careful tones, aware that their experiences might sound like betrayal to men and women who had suffered. Others did not speak of it at all. A small number, estimates vary, but records suggest several thousand chose not to return. They applied for immigration status, settled in the towns nearest their camps, married, found work, and built lives in the country that had held them captive. They had arrived as enemies and left as something harder to name. The camps themselves are largely gone now. A few historical markers remain, plaques in small Mississippi towns, a preserved mess hall here and there, photographs in regional museums of men in Wehrmacht uniforms sitting at American picnic tables with tin cups of coffee. The story they represent is not well remembered, perhaps because it does not fit neatly into the stories that wars are supposed to tell. There is no famous battle here, no decisive command decision. Just the daily, unglamorous work of feeding people, of honoring a treaty, even when no one was watching, of having enough, more than enough, and sharing it with men who had come to destroy you. That was the lesson Hans Becker carried home to Bavaria in 1946. Not that America was perfect, not that the war had been anything other than catastrophic, but that a nation's truest power is not always visible in its weapons. Sometimes it is visible in what it sets on a table, in whether that table has enough, in whether, even in wartime, even for its enemies, it finds a way to make sure it does. They had mocked American food. They had laughed at the chocolate and the coffee and the canned peaches. They had called it weakness. But weakness does not feed the world while fighting it. Weakness does not set a place at the table for the men who came to burn it down. What they tasted in those mess halls was not indulgence. It was confidence. The deep, quiet certainty of a nation that knew, even in its darkest hours, that it had enough, and in that certainty, the last laugh of the war was served not in triumph, but in silence, in the scrape of a spoon against a tin ball, in the steam rising from a cup of real coffee, in a prisoner who paused before his meal, looked down at his plate, and understood too late, and took clearly exactly what he had been fighting against.